Good day, EFC students. Welcome to Unit 5, Managing Ethics. Today's lecture is all about looking at a code of ethics and the importance of having a code of ethics within an organization. So if we get started and if we look at the structure of the course is made up of 5 units, and this being the last unit. And once we've completed with the last unit, we then will commence with the 2 assignments, which then will take place in the second half of the semester. So today's lecture is all about diving deeper into the concept of having a code of ethics and why is it so important to have a code of ethics as part of an organization. So the case study that we are using for today's lecture is Steinhoff. And the reason we are using Steinhoff is that Steinhoff, like the many corporate scandals that you've already discovered, is considered to be one of the largest South African corporate scandals. And Steinhoff is also a very recent scandal. It was a scandal that took place in December 2017. And the consequences as a result of the Steinhoff scandal was actually quite detrimental to the economy. It caused a lot of chaos. And ultimately, it was just fraud in pure simple terms. So there is a link where you'd be able to actually read up more on the Steinhoff scandal. But what I just want to bring your attention to is that in summary, the Steinhoff scandal basically resulted in $7.4 billion in accounting fraud. So it was just, again, creative accounting that had actually caused this fraud. And you are welcome to read the article below to actually gain more context into this particular scandal. Also, what's very important and why also Steinhoff for this particular class is that Steinhoff had a code of ethics, but in its corporate governance report that used to get published on a yearly basis, it had the governance report stated specifically that yes, while Steinhoff actually did have a code of ethics, what they found was that there was no formal process that could actually be established around was this code of ethics actually successfully implemented? So was there awareness being created around the code of ethics? Were the values as per the code of ethics, was that actually promoted within the organization? Also, they found issues around ethical compliance. And this report was basically an issue from 2011, 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, and then in 2017, we saw the scandal unveiling itself. So what we can actually take from this particular case here is that yes, having a code of ethics does drive ethical behavior. But the most important thing is that we need to make sure that this is implemented successfully. There are proper awareness techniques in place to ensure that it is made practical and that employees actually make use of the code of ethics in an effective manner. Now, going to the lecture itself, the units that you'd be looking at is 22 to 25, and below are the learning outcomes for this particular unit. So why is it necessary to have a code of ethics? So the main goal behind a code of ethics is that it needs to drive ethical behavior, because the moment an organization is considered to be an unethical entity, you find that there's a number of consequences that come as a result of that, like reputational damage. There's sometimes financial losses because of all of them. I mean, if we look at the Steinhoff case, there was the overstatement of the 7.4 billion, but then that also has an impact on your shareholders' returns, etc. So there's a number of consequences as a result of unethical behavior. And therefore, a code of ethics acts as a tool to try and assist in driving ethical behavior. Now, what standard will a company use to measure its ethical performance? So here, what's important is that ethical performance will be measured against the company's code of ethics. Now, if you notice with a number of corporate scandals, the first thing that shareholders tend to ask is like, why wasn't the company acting in terms of its code of ethics? Yes, we hear questions such as, where were the auditors? Why weren't the auditors involved? Why didn't the auditors pick this up? But an important question is also around the code of ethics. We see that with a number of scandals that take place is that the code of ethics is what drives the question as to why was this company not acting in terms of its code of ethics. Then, in terms of a code of ethics, there are two types of code of ethics that a company will basically implement. Now, they would either choose either a directional code or an aspirational code. So in simple terms, a directional code is more what they would say is a compliance type of a code of ethics. So it would just say, you are required to do this. You need to do this. So it's very, very, very detailed. It tells you exactly what it is that needs to be done. Whilst with a value-based or an aspirational code of ethics is referred to a value-based code of ethics. And an aspirational code of ethics is actually considered to be the most commonly used type of code of ethics, because you would just see things like our core values are integrity, honesty, confidentiality. So it's very value-based and it focuses only on the values. Whilst with the directional code, you will do this, you will do that. And we will look at two examples later in today's class. Also, what you need to take note of is that when it comes to making the decision as to whether you choose a directional code or an aspirational code, you have to consider what it is that's best for your particular organization and what is the goal that you are trying to achieve as a result of implementing this particular code of ethics. Now, if we have to just look at, yes, whilst having a code of ethics can assist in driving ethical behavior, one of the most common questions are, is there any limitations or are there limitations with regards to a code of ethics? And the reality is that yes. And some of these limitations include things like employees of that particular organization think specifically and only in terms of a code of ethics. Therefore, you're hindering development and moral autonomy. So people cannot think independently. All they think is that this is the code of ethics, this is what I need to follow, and that is all that they do. They don't think outside the code of ethics. So it generally tends to cause a limitation in terms of people's thinking when it comes to thinking about ethical issues or ethical matters. You also actually need skills in order to use a code of ethics. And many of us will be like, but hey, a code of ethics is actually so simple to understand. But training is necessary, because having a code of ethics is one thing, but implementing it, making sure that employees are aware is then considered another aspect. May silence other views. So here what we see is that because we are using only a code of ethics, what tends to happen is that the thinking and that only then depends on the code of ethics. People, again, will not think outside that particular code of ethics. And even if they have certain viewpoints or whatever it is, because you have this code of ethics that's like in hard and fast writing, you are then limited in terms of this particular code of ethics, and you don't actually have that freedom to actually express any views. Also, there can be the whole thing of where a code of ethics is just counterproductive. So yes, you have the code of ethics, and like with a corporate scandal, what we see is that yes, every organization that you would have came across in the various corporate scandals all had codes of ethics, but you can have it and it can actually serve no purpose if people are then just going to go ahead and commit any types of fraud. So now, how exactly can we go about implementing a code of ethics? So yes, you need to communicate with your employees, and you need to make sure that they understand exactly what it is that's required of them in terms of that particular code of ethics. You can have certain launches where you launch your code of ethics, and again, you're emphasizing the importance of the code of ethics. Then when you train or you provide training, it's so important to use case studies. And I mean, that's the reason we also using case studies, is that where you can practically see the importance of having those code of ethics or ethics in general within the workplace. Then institutionalizing ethics. So here what we mean is that within an organization, we need to make sure that ethics is basically driven on two levels, the strategic level and the systems level. Now, how I want you to look at the two is that strategic level is the very top. It's basically big picture. It's the very high level, and the systems level is then where we're going into detail. And this is now where we're digging deeper. So strategic, high level, and systems level, detail. Now, if we dive a little bit more deeper into strategic level, here we are looking at your board of directors. Now, here your board of directors are the ones who need to make sure that they are ultimately responsible for the code of ethics. They need to make sure that this code of ethics is then driven down basically from the top to the bottom of the organization. It is important to inform your stakeholders, so your employees, your shareholders, bankers, etc., of your code of ethics, because they obviously have a vested interest within your organization. And when it comes to managing ethical performance, the board of directors are the ones who make the decisions on the top, so i.e. on the strategic level, before that can actually be implemented. And then they need to make sure that ethical performance is managed, and they also make the decision as to how this will actually be managed. And then when it comes to looking at the strategies are then broken down into the compliance and the integrity strategies. And on the next slide, you will see that this then links back to the directional and the aspirational code of ethics. So the compliance strategy does talk to the directional code of ethics. And this here is now just telling you exactly how you would go about on a strategic level in terms of ensuring that the compliance or the directional code is then carried forward correctly. Now, remember, the board of directors will make the decision as to whether it's going to be a compliance strategy or whether it's going to be an aspirational code, or, or the directional code in this particular case. And then they then need to decide, now, how will we actually go about in making sure that this particular code of ethics is carried out effectively. Now, one of the key things that I want to bring your attention to when it comes to a directional code is that a directional code speaks specifically, or it emphasizes the importance on prohibiting unethical behavior. So it's trying to stop unethical behavior. And by doing so, it then has a number of rules in place that you then need to abide by. Now, if we go to the integrity strategy or the aspirational code, here what we are trying to promote is we trying to promote ethical behavior. So if I go back and if we look at the previous one is how can I stop unethical behavior, whilst here we are saying how can I promote ethical behavior. And this is why we use values, or that's why the aspirational code is made up of values, so that we can promote these values, and as a result, we're hoping to achieve ethical behavior. So the goals are ultimately the same. It's just that the approach of taking with an aspirational code and a directional code is just the road basically is different. And also what I can tell you is that, yes, as I've mentioned, the aspirational code is considered to be one of the most commonly used code of ethics because it has a softer tone to it versus the compliance strategy, which is like, you have to do this, you have to do that. So employees are more likely to follow a value-based approach, so i.e. the aspirational code of ethics. Then if we have to look at institutionalizing at a systems level, now remember what we spoke about. The systems level is basically diving deeper. So at our strategic level is very high level, very on the top, and the systems level is now where we are going into the detail with regards to the code of ethics. And it's ultimately the board of directors' responsibility to ensure that that particular code of ethics is then communicated to the bottom, and it's going from the top to the bottom, but they are then ultimately responsible for making sure that this is carried out effectively. Then when it comes to looking at specifically at the systems level, so yes, at the strategy comes from the top, as we've spoken about, but ultimately what needs to happen is that on a systems level, we need to have various systems in place in order to ensure that the code of ethics is carried out effectively. And some of these systems include communication, staffing, induction, performance, training, disciplinary, monitoring, and evaluation systems. So we'll talk about each of these systems on the next slide, but this in simple terms just basically says that the strategy needs to then obviously materialize. And how can we actually make this materialize is by having different systems in place in order to ensure that the code of ethics is carried out effectively. Now, with the communication system, this is now where we are ensuring that our employees are aware of the code of ethics. So we are communicating on an ongoing basis to our employees, to our stakeholders, to ensure that they are actually aware of ethics. So ethics then starts becoming an integral part of the particular organization. Then your staffing system, hire and promote people of integrity. So many organizations have these systems in place where employees are required to display their ability to maybe display certain values, you know. So if you've basically done something at a particular client and it was an example of where you showed integrity, it's things like that there that will then work in your favor. And many organizations are most likely going to hire people of integrity. So it's also the staffing or your HR system. And that is why HR actually does a lot of checks on employees before they actually hire them. Then also when it comes to an induction system. So as employees join organizations, one of the things that they actually one of the things that actually gets emphasized to employees is the whole thing on the code of ethics. So creating a culture of ethical awareness as part of your performance appraisal, you know. I can tell you, for example, at UJ, we are required to indicate how did we actually, you know, keep the UJ values alive? What did we do to actually keep these values alive? So here, what it should actually be about is that ethical behavior is promoted amongst employees, and using your appraisal system is then just emphasizing and ensuring that you stick to the code of ethics. Training system. So here we have ongoing training to make sure that employees are made aware of the code of ethics and that they understand the code of ethics and that it's ingrained into employees. Disciplinary systems, a number of organizations have disciplinary systems in place. And the reason that we have disciplinary systems in place is to ensure that in the event of there being any unethical behavior, these organizations make sure that they are following procedures in order to make sure that that particular unethical behavior is dealt with correctly. And then when it comes to things like monitoring and evaluation, here it's all about a company keeping all of its unethical issues or ethical issues or whatever it is, that this is then maintained on an ongoing basis. A very common thing that a number of organizations have in place is actually ethics helplines. So you have people who, what they refer to as whistleblowing, where they contact these helplines and they report maybe fraud or any unethical behavior that they see within their organization. But the whole idea is that we're monitoring and we're evaluating all ethical and unethical behavior on an ongoing basis. And then when it comes to reporting and disclosing of ethical performance, or if we have to ask the question, what is the objective of reporting? So ultimately, reporting comes down to making sure that we inform our stakeholders of what it is that's going on. And an important part of reporting is the triple bottom line, which we spoke about in Unit 4. So yes, reporting about ethics within your organization forms an integral part of the triple bottom line. Then, just for your own information, there are certain standards that specifically give guidance in terms of how you need to go about, in terms of disclosing ethical behavior, ethical performance. And this is more just for you to know, but there are now standards and that even being further developed to give further guidance when it comes to looking at ethical performance. And also another thing is that it is important to report on what's going on within your organization because stakeholders are interested, especially as we see a rise in corporate scandals, fraud, etc. Stakeholders are interested in seeing what it is that's going on within an organization. Then also just important when it comes to ethical reporting is that your reporting has to be very clear, it has to be reliable, so it has to be based on facts. And also this information then gets audited as part of your integrated report so that the information that goes out to the stakeholders and to those that are making use of that report is then considered to be honest and is also full of integrity. Now, looking at this particular code of ethics, and we're going to look at the difference between a value-based, so i.e. an aspirational code of ethics, and a directional code of ethics. Now, if we can look at this particular code, so i.e. the Barlow world, and if we have to see what it basically consists of, Barlow world's code of ethics just basically consists of these principles, and they just refer to the term as these values are reflected in our code of ethics. And if we have to just look at the next one, this is the SAB Miller Code of Ethics, and it just says, with regards to its human resources, to reinforce the principles of enlightened and humane employment practices, and in particular too. And it then gives you a whole list of the particular aspects that make up this particular code of ethics. And what we can see, and even if we actually, look at the Barlow world versus the SAB Miller, you can see that the SAB Miller is obviously a much longer code of ethics. It goes into a lot of details, and it's also very, yes, you will do this, or to act in a fashion that will earn the group the reputation of being. And then it lists all of the points. Whilst if you have to just look at the Barlow world, it's saying these values are reflected in our code of ethics, and it lists the particular values that then actually need to be abided by that particular organization. And by using the words our, it creates that feeling of softness. And remember, we spoke about saying that an aspirational code is a very soft code of ethics. It actually relates to employees in a much better manner, whilst if I have to just look at part of the SAB Miller Code of Ethics with regards to its human resources. So it basically disconnects the employee element. So therefore, it is considered to be a more harder code of ethics. And then, as you can see, as we spoke, we said that the Barlow world is considered as the aspirational code, and the SAB is considered to be the directional code of ethics. And that's it for Unit 5. I trust that you all enjoyed this particular lecture. And for any questions or anything that you may have, please feel free to reach out to myself. and you are welcome to post your questions on the consultation discussion board. Wishing you all a good day further, and I look forward to engaging with you on this particular unit.